The wet canvas clung to Elise Brennan's face like a death shroud, each thread seeming to tighten around her nose and mouth with deliberate malice. Water dripped steadily from the coarse fabric, muddy water from the horse trough that tasted of rust and decay. Her lungs screamed for air as the cloth pressed deeper with each desperate attempt to draw breath. "I can't breathe," she gasped when someone momentarily loosened the suffocating barrier. The words came out in English, though her mind raced with German prayers her father Gustav had taught her as a child in the Bavarian mountains. "Lieber Gott, help me," she thought, remembering how Papa would tuck her into bed with stories of brave knights who never surrendered to evil, no matter how dark the night became. "Tell us where you hid the savage boy." Sheriff Malcolm Dwyer's voice cut through the jeering crowd that had gathered in Willow Springs' dusty Main Street. His pale eyes held the cold satisfaction of a man who enjoyed his work far too much. The late afternoon sun cast his shadow long and menacing across the packed earth. "Make this easy on yourself, Miss Brennan." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the wooden buildings, but no shadow could hide the ugly transformation that had seized the townspeople. Faces she recognized: Mrs. Patterson, who bought fresh eggs from her boarding house every Tuesday morning, Tom Wheeler, who delivered her mail with a cheerful tip of his hat, even young Sally Morrison, who had helped her hang laundry just last week while chattering about her upcoming wedding, all twisted with a hatred that made her stomach turn to ice. Elise tried to speak, tried to explain that she had saved the Cheyenne boy, not kidnapped him. But the canvas muffled everything into choking sobs. Her wrists burned where the rough rope bit deep, cutting through her skin until she could feel warm blood trickling down her arms. The pain seemed distant compared to the primal terror of drowning in open air. But it anchored her to consciousness when the world began to fade at the edges like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Memories flooded through her oxygen-starved mind, Papa teaching her to read survey maps by candlelight in their small cabin during the brutal Colorado winters, his patient voice explaining how water always found the fairest path down the mountain. "Water is life, Menschatz," he would say, tracing the blue lines with his weathered finger, calloused from years of handling surveying instruments. "Whoever controls the water controls the future of this land. Never forget that." Those words seemed prophetic now as death pressed against her face in the form of a canvas that bore, she had glimpsed in her terror, the burned-in brand of the Brimstone Cattle Company. Even through her growing panic, that detail lodged in her mind like a splinter. Why would Lucian Pike's company canvas be used to torture her? What connection could there be between the territory's most powerful cattle baron and her supposed crime? "String her up," someone shouted from the back of the mob, the voice thick with bloodlust. Foreign witch probably carved up greasy Pete with one of them German knives her kind always carries. Dwyer raised his hand for silence, studying Elise with the calculation of a man who had perfected cruelty over many years of frontier law enforcement. At 45, the sheriff had grown soft around the middle from too many free drinks at the saloons, but his gun hand remained steady, and his smile promised violence to anyone who crossed him. Now, he said in a voice like poisoned honey dripping from a broken comb. "Let's give the lady another chance to confess her sins. Where's the Indian boy? Where's Natus? Tell us, and this all ends quick and merciful-like." The name hit her like a physical blow that knocked the remaining air from her lungs. Nidus, the 10-year-old Cheyenne child she had hidden in her boarding house root cellar when this same mob had come hunting with torches and dogs 3 nights ago. She had fed him her grandmother's Kartoffelsuppe from the old country, thick with potatoes and herbs that reminded her of home. She had bandaged the cut on his forehead where someone had thrown a bottle of glass, leaving a jagged wound that had bled far too much for such a small boy to bear. She had sung him German lullabies while he shivered with fever and fear, his dark eyes so much like Papa's when he was troubled by nightmares of the war he'd left behind in Bavaria. "Please," she managed to whisper through the wet cloth that tasted of horse sweat and human cruelty. He was just a frightened child who needed help. The canvas descended again, heavier this time, soaked until it felt like drowning in a mountain lake during the spring thaw. Elise's world narrowed to the desperate struggle for each breath, her body arching against the ropes as consciousness flickered like a candle in a windstorm. She could hear Papa's voice from years past when she was 12 and had fallen through thin ice while skating. Fight mein Liebling. Never stop fighting. There is always hope even in the darkest water. Through the roaring in her ears that sounded like rushing rapids, she heard new voices, angry shouts, in a language she didn't recognize, the sound of scuffling boots on wooden sidewalks, someone barking orders with unmistakable authority. The pressure on the canvas eased slightly, and she sucked in a precious gulp of air mixed with cotton fibers and her own tears. Step away from her now. The voice carried absolute command, cutting through the mob's fury like her father's surveyor's blade through tangled brush. Elise couldn't see who had spoken, but she felt the crowd's energy shift from bloodlust to uncertainty, like a pack of wolves suddenly confronted by a larger predator. "This ain't your concern, Red Man." Dwyer snarled, and she heard the distinctive click of a gun being cocked, the sound sharp as a breaking bone in the evening air. "Walk away before you join her on the rope." "The only one walking away," came the reply in accented but precise English, each word chosen with the care of a man who had learned the white man's language through necessity rather than choice. "Will be you. Unless you prefer to explain to federal marshals why you're torturing defenseless women in the street like savages." A moment of perfect silence stretched between heartbeats, thick with the promise of violence. Then chaos erupted like a powder keg touched by flame. The canvas was ripped away from Elise's face with such sudden violence that the afternoon sky seemed blindingly bright, painted in shades of gold and crimson that hurt her eyes. Strong hands worked at her bonds, while gunfire cracked around them like 4th of July fireworks, but deadly and close enough that she could smell the acrid powder smoke. She caught a glimpse of her rescuer, a tall man with copper skin, weathered by years of hard-living black hair, braided with eagle feathers, and small bones that clicked softly when he moved. He wore buckskin pants decorated with intricate beadwork and a faded cavalry jacket that had seen better days, probably taken from a dead soldier after some long-ago battle. His dark eyes met hers for just an instant, and she saw something unexpected there, not pity, but recognition. The look of someone who understood intimately what it meant to be hunted by people who saw you as less than human. "Now, can you run?" he asked, his voice steady despite the bullets whining overhead like angry hornets. Elise nodded weakly, though her legs felt like they were made of prairie grass, bending in a strong wind. The man, clearly Cheyenne, from his dress and bearing, cut through her wrist bindings with a knife that gleamed silver in the dying light, its blade worn smooth by years of use. Blood rushed back into her hands in waves of agony that made her gasp and bite her lip to keep from crying out. But it was clean pain, honest pain, living pain, that meant she was still alive to feel it. "Near this way," he commanded, pulling her upright. Just as Sheriff Dwyer's pistol barked behind them, the bullet striking sparks from the iron wheel rim of a nearby wagon. They stumbled together toward the narrow alley between Morrison's general store and the barber shop, her rescuer supporting her weight, when her knees threatened to buckle like a newborn colt's. Behind them, she could hear Dwyer cursing creatively in language that would have made a cavalry sergeant proud, while someone, probably Doc Patterson, by the sound of his gravelly voice, tended to what sounded like a dislocated shoulder. "Stop right there, you red bastard." Dwyer bellowed, his voice thick with pain and rage that made it crack like a whip. "I'll see you both hang before Christmas, I swear it on my mother's grave." More gunshots echoed through the evening air, and wood exploded from the storefront beside Elise's head splinters, catching in her hair like confetti from hell. Her rescuer pressed her against the wall with one strong arm, while returning fire with a lever-action carbine that seemed to materialize in his hands like magic. The precise shots drove the mob back toward the courthouse steps, buying them precious seconds to escape the killing ground of Main Street. The creek, he said quietly, reloading with practiced efficiency that spoke of many battles survived and enemies defeated. Can you make it to Ash Creek without collapsing? Elise looked toward the cottonwoods that marked the water's winding path through the valley, perhaps 200 yards away, across open ground littered with barrel hoops, discarded lumber, and the debris of frontier life. It might as well have been 200 miles given her condition, but she nodded anyway. What choice did she have? Death waited behind them, and only the slim hope of survival lay ahead. They ran together through the gathering dusk, feet pounding on sun-baked earth that threw up small clouds of dust with each desperate step. Elise's lungs burned with every breath, still raw from the water torture that had nearly killed her. But terror drove her forward with desperate energy she didn't know she possessed. Behind them, Dwyer's voice cut through the confusion as he organized a proper pursuit, his words sharp with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. $50 to the man who brings them back. The sheriff roared his voice, carrying across the evening air like a death sentence. Dead or alive makes no difference to me. Just bring me proof they're finished. They plunged into the green sanctuary of the creekside willows, just as lanterns began to appear along the bank like fallen stars, bobbing and weaving as searchers spread out to cut off their escape routes. Elise collapsed to her knees in the soft mud that smelled of fish and rotting vegetation, finally allowing herself to cough up the filthy water she had swallowed during her ordeal. Her whole body shook with delayed shock and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her completely. "Thank you," she whispered when she could speak again, her voice hoarse as a crow's call in the morning mist. "I don't even know your name, but you saved my life." "No Wakiza," he replied, pressing a strip of cloth torn from his shirt against a wound on his shoulder where a bullet had creased him. Blood seeped between his fingers, looking black in the pale moonlight. "And you are Elise Brennan, the German woman who owns the boarding house on Maple Street." She nodded, surprised that he knew her name and circumstances. In a town the size of Willow Springs, most people were familiar faces, but she had rarely spoken to any of the Cheyenne, who occasionally came to trade horses or sell game to the local merchants. The gap between their worlds had seemed too wide to bridge with mere conversation. "How did you know to help me?" she asked, genuinely curious about what had motivated this stranger to risk his life for hers. Wakiza was quiet for a moment, listening to the sounds of pursuit growing closer. Dogs barking with the excitement of a fresh scent trail. Men calling to each other through the darkness in voices rough with excitement and anticipated violence. The splash of boots in shallow water as searchers spread out along both sides of the creek. "I've been looking for my sister's son," he said finally, his voice heavy with worry that had clearly been eating at him for days. "A 10-year-old boy named Needus. Sheriff Dwyer claims you kidnapped him from his family." Elise's heart clenched like a fist around a burning coal. So this was the child's uncle, the family member she had wondered about, while feeding the boy soup and telling him stories from the Brothers Grimm. The resemblance was clear now, that she thought about it, the same proud bearing, the same intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "I didn't kidnap him," she said fiercely, surprised by the strength that returned to her voice when she spoke of the boy. "I saved him from a mob that wanted to string him up just for being Indian. There was a crowd hunting him with dogs and torches, calling him terrible names I won't repeat. I hid him in my root cellar and prayed to God they wouldn't find us both." Wakiza studied her face in the pale moonlight that filtered through the willow branches, searching for deception, with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to trust easily, in a world where betrayal often meant death. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because his shoulders relaxed slightly, and some of the tension left his posture. "Where is he now?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already feared the answer. "Gone when I woke up yesterday morning." Elise admitted the words, tasting bitter as wormwood. "I thought I hoped he had slipped away in the night and made it back to his people safely. But if you're here looking for him, then he never made it home, Wakiza confirmed grimly. Which means someone else has him, and they're using his disappearance to frame you for kidnapping. A lantern swung close to their hiding spot, casting dancing shadows through the reeds that made them both freeze like rabbits under a hawk's shadow. Wakiza motioned for silence, and they pressed deeper into the marsh, crawling on hands and knees through mud that smelled of decay and old secrets. Elise's dress, the blue cotton one Papa had bought her in Denver for her 21st birthday, was already ruined beyond repair. But she found she didn't care. Vanity seemed like a luxury from another lifetime before her world had been turned upside down by accusations of kidnapping and murder. They reached a fallen cottonwood that created a natural bridge across the creek's main channel, its massive trunk worn smooth by countless spring floods. Wakiza helped her across, then paused to tear more strips from his shirt and bind his shoulder wound more securely. The bleeding had slowed but not stopped, and she could see exhaustion beginning to tell on his weathered features. "There's a line shack about a mile upstream," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite what must have been considerable pain. "Belongs to a farmer named Adam Fitch. If we can reach it without being seen, we might have shelter for the night and time to figure out what's really happening here. Can we trust this Adam Fitch?" Elise asked, thinking of how quickly her neighbors had turned against her. People she had known for years who had shared meals at her table and borrowed sugar when theirs ran low had been ready to watch her tortured to death in the street. Fitch has his own troubles with powerful men who want his land. Wakiza replied with the bitter knowledge of someone who had seen too much injustice. They've been pressuring him to sell his farm, making threats when he refuses. I think desperation makes for strange allies, and right now we both need all the friends we can find. The line shack appeared ahead of them like a miracle made of weathered logs and tar paper tucked into a grove of aspens whose leaves whispered secrets in the night wind. Yellow light glowed behind oil paper windows, and thin smoke rose from a stone chimney that promised warmth and safety. It looked like the most beautiful thing Elise had ever seen, a beacon of hope in a world that had suddenly turned hostile and deadly. Wakiza approached the door cautiously, his carbine ready, but not obviously threatening. The last thing they needed was to be shot by a nervous farmer who mistook them for raiders or thieves. "Adam," he called softly into the night air. "It's Wakiza. I need help, and I need it badly." The door opened immediately, as if the occupant had been waiting for exactly this arrival. Adam Fitch revealed himself to be a stocky man in his 40s, with work-hardened hands that bore the permanent stains of soil and honest labor. Worry lines were etched deep around his eyes, and his hair had gone prematurely gray from stress, but his expression brightened considerably when he recognized Wakiza, Jesus, and Mary. He breathed, stepping aside to let them enter his simple home. "I heard the shooting in town clear out here. Figured Pike's boys had finally decided to settle things the hard way instead of using lawyers and politicians." The interior of the shack was sparse but meticulously clean, with a stone fireplace that threw dancing shadows on log walls, a rough pine table scarred by years of use, and 2 cots covered with wool blankets that looked Indian-made. The warmth felt like salvation after the cold fear of the past few hours, and Elise found herself trembling with relief as feelings slowly returned to her frozen limbs. "This is Elise Brennan," Wakiza said, settling carefully onto one of the cots and favoring his wounded shoulder. "She's the woman they were torturing in town tonight. The one they claim kidnapped my nephew." Adam's eyes widened as he took in Elise's bedraggled appearance. Her torn dress stained with mud and blood, and the rope burns on her wrists that were already turning purple and black, the haunted look that came from staring death in the face, and somehow walking away to tell the tale. When he spoke, his voice was thick with genuine outrage. "Sweet Mother of God, he whispered unconsciously, crossing himself with the automatic gesture of a man raised in the Catholic faith. What kind of animals would do such a thing to a woman? What kind of men torture the innocent in broad daylight, like we're living in the Dark Ages? The same animals who've been threatening to burn your crops if you don't sell your land to Pike. Wakiza replied grimly, accepting a cup of coffee that smelled like liquid salvation. This is all connected, Adam. Pike the sheriff, my missing nephew, it's all part of the same web of corruption and greed. Adam poured coffee for all of them from a pot that had been simmering by the fire, his movements sharp with suppressed anger that made the cups rattle against their saucers. The coffee was strong enough to float a horseshoe nail, but it helped chase away some of the cold that had settled into Elise's bones like a permanent winter. I've been saying for months that Pike's got the sheriff in his pocket like a trained dog, Adam said, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight. Problem is, nobody wants to listen until it's their turn to get squeezed by his operation. By then, it's usually too late to do anything but surrender or die. They're listening now. Elise said quietly, wrapping her hands around the warm cup and feeling strength slowly return to her voice. At least they will be once we prove what's really happening in this territory. If we live long enough to prove anything. Adam replied, glancing nervously toward the window where the oil paper covering filtered the light into soft golden patterns. Pike's got men combing every inch of the county by now, and they're not the type to take prisoners. And Dwyer's got the law on his side, crooked as a dog's hind leg though it may be. A sound outside made them all freeze like deer caught in an open meadow, the soft snort of a horse, then the creak of leather as someone dismounted near the cabin. Adam blew out the oil lamp with one quick breath, plunging the interior into darkness, lit only by the dying embers of the fire. "Stay quiet and don't move," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as he moved toward the window with a shotgun that had appeared in his hands like magic. Through the oil paper covering, they could see the silhouette of a single rider, leading her horse toward the shack with careful, deliberate steps. "Adam," a woman's voice called softly through the night air. "It's Nora Avery. I saw riders heading this way from town, and I need to warn you about what's coming." Adam relaxed visibly, setting down his shotgun with obvious relief. "The school teacher," he explained to the others as he moved to open the door. "Good woman, even if she is a bit too educated for her own good sometimes." Nora Avery stepped into the firelight, and Elise immediately understood why the children of Willow Springs spoke of their teacher with such devotion and respect. She was a woman in her early 30s, with intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing and steady hands that spoke of inner strength. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun that had come slightly loose during her hard ride, and her traveling dress showed the quality that came from Eastern money, though it was now dusty from urgent travel through rough country. "I heard about what happened in town," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the crisp authority of a classroom where unruly children learned to respect learning and order. "What they did to Miss Brennan was an abomination that would shame civilized people anywhere in the world. I've been asking questions around town, trying to understand why Sheriff Dwyer would allow such barbarity to take place on his watch." "And what did you discover in your investigation?" Wakiza asked, studying the newcomer with the careful attention he gave to all potential allies. In his experience, trust had to be earned through actions rather than words. Nora pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket, handling it like it might explode in her hands. "This is a purchase order from the county clerk's office dated 2 weeks ago. It shows that Sheriff Dwyer personally authorized the purchase of 50 yards of canvas from Morrison's General Store, paid for with county funds, but delivered directly to Pike's Brimstone Ranch." The implications hit Elise like a physical blow that made her stomach turn with nausea. "They planned this," she said, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear now. "The whole torture session was planned in advance. They were going to hurt me regardless of whether I had done anything wrong or could tell them anything useful. But why? Adam asked, leaning forward with intense interest. What do they gain by destroying an innocent woman who runs a boarding house? What threat could you possibly pose to men like Pike and Dwyer? Before anyone could answer that crucial question, the sound of approaching horses drifted through the night air. Many horses moving at a steady pace that suggested organized pursuit rather than random searching by amateur trackers. The sound grew louder with each passing second, accompanied by the baying of hounds that had picked up a fresh scent trail. "They've found us," Wakiza said grimly, checking his carbine with practiced efficiency born of many battles. "Either someone saw us come this way, or those dogs are better than I gave them credit for." Adam moved to the window again, peering through a gap in the oil paper covering that gave him a view of the approaching danger. 8 riders, maybe 10, spread out in a line like they're sweeping the whole area. They'll be here in less than 5 minutes, and there's nowhere to run that they won't see us. There's a root cellar behind the shack. Nora said quickly, her teacher's mind already working on practical solutions to immediate problems. Hidden under a pile of firewood that looks like it's been there for years. It's not much, but it might keep them from finding you long enough to figure out your next move. They gathered their few possessions and slipped out the back door, moving as quietly as possible toward the woodpile that Nora had described. Adam and the school teacher worked together to shift the logs with practiced efficiency, revealing a crude wooden door set into the ground like the entrance to a tomb. The cellar beneath was little more than a hole lined with stones, barely large enough for 2 people to crouch uncomfortably, but it would have to suffice. Elise and Wakiza squeezed into the cramped space, while the others replaced the firewood above them, effectively sealing them into their hiding place. The darkness was complete and oppressive, pressing against them like a living thing that wanted to crush the breath from their lungs. Elise found herself thinking of the canvas again, the way it had cut off her air, and made her feel like she was being buried alive. "Are you managing this?" Wakiza asked quietly, his voice barely audible through the layers of wood and earth above them. "No," she admitted with surprising honesty, grateful that the darkness hid her expression. "I don't think I'll ever be the same again after today. But I'm alive, and that's more than I expected a few hours ago when that canvas was pressed against my face." Above them, they could hear voices as the search party reached the shack, followed by the sound of heavy boots tramping across the wooden floor as Pike's men conducted a thorough search of the interior. Someone, probably Dwyer himself, judging by the harsh, demanding tone, questioned Adam and Nora with obvious suspicion and barely controlled violence. "Haven't seen hide nor hair of them," Adam was saying with convincing sincerity, his voice steady despite what must have been considerable fear. "If they came this way from town, they didn't stop here to chat about the weather." "You're lying through your teeth, Fitch," came Dwyer's voice, thick with frustration and something that might have been desperation. "We tracked them right to your door with the dogs. They were here and recently." "Then maybe your tracking skills aren't as sharp as you think they are," Nora replied coolly, her teacher's voice, carrying the authority that had cowed countless troublemakers over the years. "Have you considered that they might have doubled back toward town? Criminals often hide in plain sight, and your quarry strikes me as being more intelligent than average." There was a long silence punctuated by the sound of furniture being moved and drawers being jerked open with unnecessary violence. Then the boots moved away from the shack, and the horses departed at a trot that suggested the searchers were moving on to check other possible hiding places. They waited another full hour in the suffocating darkness before emerging from their hiding place, muscles cramped and spirits worn thin by the close call. The night was growing truly cold now, with frost beginning to form on the grass, and without the warm shack for shelter, they would need to find somewhere else to wait for dawn. "There's an old mining claim up in the foothills," Adam said, rubbing circulation back into his arms while speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Been abandoned for years since the vein played out, but it's got a roof and walls that will keep the weather off. Might be your best bet for staying hidden until you can figure out your next move. Alrakal, what about you and Miss Avery? Elise asked, touched by their kindness to strangers who had brought nothing but danger to their door. Won't Dwyer suspect you helped us escape his net? Adam shrugged with the fatalistic acceptance of a man who had already lost most of what mattered to him. They can suspect all they want, but suspicion isn't proof. I've got a witness that I was here all evening discussing the purchase of school supplies with Miss Avery for her students. Nothing illegal about conducting legitimate business. Nora handed Wakiza a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, her movements quick and efficient. Medical supplies, she explained. And some food that should last you a day or two. It's not much, but it should help with that shoulder wound and keep you from starving while you plan your next step. Thank you, Wakiza said simply, but his dark eyes conveyed depths of gratitude that mere words couldn't express. Both of you have risked more than you should for strangers. I won't forget this kindness, no matter how this ends. Just see that it ends with justice being done. Nora replied firmly. This territory has seen enough corruption and violence. It's time for decent people to stand up and be counted regardless of the personal cost. They set off through the darkness, following a deer trail that wound up into the pine-covered hills above the valley floor. Elise's legs ached. With every step, the rope burns had stiffened while they hid in the cellar, and her boots weren't designed for mountain climbing. But she forced herself to keep moving. Behind them, the lights of Willow Springs twinkled like fallen stars, deceptively peaceful in the distance, while concealing the evil that had been done in its streets. The climb took them through terrain that grew increasingly wild and beautiful with each step. Towering pines gave way to twisted juniper and mountain mahogany that clung to life in impossible places, and the air grew thin enough to make each breath a conscious effort. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns that seemed alien to someone raised under the softer skies of Bavaria. But there was a terrible beauty in this harsh landscape that spoke to something deep in her soul. Tell me about Nitis, she said during a brief rest stop, wanting to break the silence that had settled between them like a heavy blanket. What kind of boy is he? What does he love to do? Wakiza was quiet for so long that she thought he hadn't heard her question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief, mixed with fresh fear for a child's safety. He's my sister's son. He began slowly, as if the words were being pulled from some deep place in his heart. Wachiwi, that means dancer in our language. She had a gift for finding joy in the simplest things, could make even the hardest winters seem bearable with her laughter and songs. The whole tribe loved her for her gentle spirit. What happened to her? Elise asked gently, though she already suspected the answer from the pain in his voice. The white man's fever came to our camp 2 winters ago. Wakiza continued, his voice barely audible above the night wind. Too many died that season, the old ones, and the very young, and some like Wachiwi, who should have had many more years ahead of them. She fought the sickness for days, but in the end, it took her away from us. I'm sorry, Elise said, and meant it with all her heart. She knew what it was like to lose family to forces beyond anyone's control, to wake up each morning and remember all over again that someone precious was never coming back. Nitis has been living with my grandmother since then. Wakiza went on, but she's getting old and can't watch him as closely as a growing boy needs. He's been spending more time around the edges of white settlements, trying to earn money for trade goods, sugar and flour blankets, and metal tools that our people need but can't make for ourselves. He's a good boy, Elise said, remembering the child's careful politeness, even in his terror, or the way he had helped her tend her small vegetable garden while hiding in her cellar. Frightened by what had happened to him, but brave enough to keep going. He told me his mother had taught him which plants were good for healing and which ones would make you sick if you ate them. That sounds like Wachiwi's teaching, Wakiza said, with the first hint of a smile she had seen from him. She knew more about plant medicine than most white doctors could cure fevers and heal wounds with herbs she gathered from the mountainsides. Needis probably came to town looking for honest work, cleaning stables, sweeping floors, anything that would earn him a few coins to take back to the tribe. He wouldn't have expected the kind of trouble he found. Elise observed, thinking of how quickly civilized people could turn savage when fear took hold of them. None of us expected this level of evil. Wakiza replied with bitter truth. But now we know what we're facing, and we can plan accordingly. They reached the abandoned mining claim, just as the first pale hint of dawn began to show in the eastern sky, like a promise of better things to come. The structure was little more than 4 walls and a roof with gaps between the logs that let in the wind and small creatures, but it offered shelter of sorts from the elements. The previous occupants had left behind the detritus of failed dreams, broken mining equipment, moldy blankets that smelled of mouse nests, and a stone fireplace that still functioned despite years of neglect. Wakiza built a small fire, while Elise examined her rope burns by the flickering light, using some of the medical supplies Nora had provided. The wounds were ugly, but showed no signs of infection, and the circulation had returned to her hands, despite the deep bruises that painted her wrists in shades of purple and black. "Let me see those injuries," Wakiza said, kneeling beside her with gentle hands that had clearly tended wounds before. His touch was careful and professional as he cleaned the rope burns with whiskey that made her gasp and bite her lip, then bound them with strips of clean cloth. The simple human kindness of it, offered freely without expectation or demand, nearly brought tears to her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had cared for her well-being with such gentle attention. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked again, studying his weathered face in the firelight. "You could have left me to that mob and concentrated all your efforts on finding Nidus. That would have been the logical thing to do." Wakiza was quiet for a moment, tying off the bandage with careful precision before meeting her eyes directly. "My grandmother taught me that all living things are connected by invisible threads," he said finally. "When you pull on one thread, you affect the entire web in ways you can't always predict. When I saw what they were doing to you in that street, I saw what they would do to Nidus if they caught him. I couldn't let that happen to anyone, especially not to someone who had tried to protect my nephew." "Even though I'm white?" she asked. "Even though my people have taken your land and hunted your families like wild animals, you are not your people any more than I am mine," Wakiza replied with simple dignity that cut through years of accumulated prejudice and fear. "You are Elise Brennan, who risked her own life to hide a frightened child when she could have turned him away without consequence. That's all I need to know about your character." The simple acceptance in his voice undid something that had been wound tight in her chest since Papa's death 2 years ago. She had been alone for so long, carrying the weight of the boarding house and her own grief without anyone to understand the burden or share the load. "My father always said that a person's worth isn't measured by the color of their skin or the language they speak," she said softly, staring into the dancing flames that threw shadows on the log walls. "It's measured by what they do when no one is watching, when there's no reward for doing right and no punishment for doing wrong. Your father sounds like he was a wise man who understood important truths." "He was the wisest man I ever knew," she said, pulling Papa's compass from her coat pocket, the one item of his that she always carried as a reminder of his guidance. The needle pointed steadily north, just as it had throughout her childhood, when he taught her to read maps and understand the land. Gustav Brennan, late of Munich in the Colorado Territory. He came here with nothing but a surveyor's instruments and a dream of building something lasting that would benefit everyone. She paused, watching the compass needle hold steady, despite everything that had happened. "The boarding house was his idea, you know. A place where travelers could find honest food and a clean bed regardless of where they came from or what language they spoke at home. He believed America was big enough for everyone if we were willing to share it fairly. But what happened to him? Wakiza asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected this was a painful subject. The question she had been dreading, the one that still woke her up at night with cold sweats and unanswered doubts. Accident, they said. His horse threw him into Eagle Rock Canyon while he was doing survey work up near the mining claims. The official report said he must have been careless, maybe drinking, though Papa never touched liquor while he was working. She trailed off, suddenly reluctant to voice the suspicions that had plagued her for 2 long years, but Wakiza's patient silence encouraged her to continue. But I never believed it was really an accident, she finally admitted. Papa was the finest horseman I ever knew. He could ride anything with 4 legs and a mane, and he was careful about everything, always checking his gear twice, always watching the weather for signs of trouble, always planning for every contingency he could imagine. Who found his body? Wakiza asked, and something in his voice suggested the question was more important than it seemed. The answer hit her like a punch to the stomach, just as it had every time she'd thought about it over the past 2 years. Long Shadow. She said, the name coming out like a curse word that tasted bitter on her tongue. He claimed he was hunting elk up in the high country and came across Papa's body at the bottom of the canyon. Brought him back to town, draped over his saddle like a deer he'd shot for meat. Wakiza's eyes sharpened with sudden, intense interest. The same Long Shadow who works for Pike as a tracker and enforcer? The same one who was probably carrying that brimstone canvas they used to torture you? The same one, Elise confirmed. And as she spoke the words, a cold certainty began crystallizing in her mind as pieces of a puzzle she had been afraid to assemble finally clicked into place. Oh God in heaven. You don't think... I think we need to find out exactly what your father was surveying when he died. Wakiza said grimly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen enough evil to recognize its patterns. And I think we need to find those survey notes before Pike's men find us. They spent the rest of the morning planning their next move, using charcoal from the fire to sketch rough maps on the cabin's wooden walls. If Gustav had been surveying mining claims or water rights, there would be official records at the county courthouse in town. But getting to those records would mean going back to Willow Springs, back into the heart of Pike's territory, where every face might be an enemy and every shadow might hide an assassin. It's suicide, Wakiza said flatly, studying their crude map of the town's layout. Dwyer will have men watching every approach, probably with orders to shoot on sight. Then we don't go into town. Elise replied, her mind working furiously on the problem. We find another way to get the information we need, such as Dr. Walter Green, she said, remembering her father's closest friend and confidant. He was Papa's partner in more than just their weekly chess games. Papa told him everything about his work, shared all his discoveries and concerns. If anyone would know what survey Papa was working on when he died, it would be Walter. Wakiza considered this possibility with the careful attention of a military strategist weighing his options. Where does this Dr. Green live? How can we reach him safely? He has a house on the north side of town near the cemetery where Papa is buried, Elise explained. But he also makes regular rounds to the mining camps up in the hills, tending to injured miners and delivering babies for the families that live in the high country. If we're fortunate, we might intercept him on one of his trips without having to risk going into town. They waited until late in the afternoon, then made their way carefully down from the foothills toward the main road that connected Willow Springs to the Timberline mine and the other camps scattered throughout the mountains. The path was treacherous, winding through stands of aspen and pine that could hide a dozen armed men. But it was their best chance of finding Dr. Green without walking into a carefully prepared trap. They had been waiting in the cover of a lightning-struck oak for nearly 3 hours when they finally heard the familiar rattle of wagon wheels on rocky ground. Dr. Green's old buckboard came into view around a bend in the road, the elderly physician hunched over the reins as his tired horse picked its way carefully along the rutted track that served as the region's main thoroughfare. Wakiza stepped into the road, with his hands raised in a gesture of peace, causing the horse to snort and shy sideways with alarm. Dr. Green reached for the rifle that lay across his knees, then stopped abruptly when he recognized Elise emerging from their hiding place among the trees. Merciful heaven. He breathed, climbing down from the wagon with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested such activity. Elise, child, what in God's name has happened to you? You look like you've been through a war. Dr. Walter Green was a man in his mid-50s with kind gray eyes and gentle hands that had saved more lives than he could count, the sort of physician who had delivered half the babies in the county and sat with their grandparents when they passed from this world to the next. He had been Gustav's closest friend for more than a decade, sharing evening games of chess and philosophical discussions that sometimes lasted until dawn painted the eastern peaks with gold. They tried to murder me, Walter, she said, simply extending her bandaged wrists for his professional examination. Sheriff Dwyer and a mob from town. They were torturing me with wet canvas, trying to make me confess to kidnapping this man's nephew. Dr. Green's weathered face darkened like storm clouds gathering over the mountains as he examined her rope burns and the bruises around her throat with a thoroughness that had made him the most respected physician in 3 counties. When he spoke, his voice was thick with genuine outrage. Animals, he muttered under his breath, his hands shaking slightly as he checked her pulse and breathing. Absolute animals without a shred of human decency. Who gave the order for this atrocity? Pike. Wakiza, said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man stating obvious facts. Lucian Pike and his hired killers. They're using the sheriff's office to do their dirty work while keeping their own hands technically clean. I should have known, Dr. Green replied, his voice bitter with old anger and newer guilt. That man is a cancer on this territory, growing stronger every year while good people suffer and die. And Dwyer's nothing but his most eager collaborator, willing to do anything for money and protection. His hands continued their examination, checking Elise's injuries with professional thoroughness. But she could see something else in his expression. A deep worry that went beyond concern for her physical condition. There was guilt there too, with the look of a man carrying secrets that had been eating at him for too long. Walter, she said gently, I need to ask you about Papa's work, about what he was surveying when he died. The doctor's hands stilled, and for a moment he looked like a man who had been struck by lightning. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Your father came to see me the night before he died. He said finally, the words seeming to be pulled from some deep place in his heart. He was more excited than I'd seen him in years, talking about some discovery up in the hills that would change everything for the better. Those were his exact words. What kind of discovery? Elise asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. Water rights. Dr. Green replied, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. Seems the original territorial survey back in 1868 had missed a major watershed up near the mining claims. Your father had discovered that the Ash River's main channel actually originated on federal land, which meant the water rights were available for filing under the Homestead Act. Elise felt the blood drain from her face as the implications crashed over her like an avalanche. The Ash River supplies water to half the ranches in the valley, including Pike's entire operation. Precisely, the doctor confirmed grimly. And under territorial law, whoever filed the proper claim would have legal control over water distribution for the entire region. Your father was planning to file the claim himself, then negotiate fair usage rights with all the downstream ranchers and farmers, including Pike. Wakiza asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Especially Pike, Dr. Green replied. Gustav had discovered that Pike had been manipulating water access for years, forcing smaller ranchers to pay extortionate fees for river water that should have been available to everyone. Your father wanted to put a stop to that practice once and for all. The motive for murder was becoming crystal clear, and Elise felt sick with the realization of how much her father's death had really cost the territory. Did Papa manage to file the claim before? I don't believe so, the doctor admitted reluctantly. He was planning to ride up to the federal land office in Quicksilver the day he died. Whether he made it there or not, I couldn't say for certain. Where are Papa's surveying notes? Elise asked, though she was beginning to fear she already knew the answer to that question as well. His maps and measurements, all the evidence of what he'd discovered. Dr. Green looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, like a man who had been carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders. When he spoke, his voice was thick with shame. That's the strangest part of the whole tragic business, he said. When they brought his body back to town, all his surveying equipment was missing. Long Shadow claimed it must have been scattered when his horse fell. But I've treated plenty of riding accidents in my time, and gear doesn't just vanish into thin air like morning mist. Long Shadow stole it, Wakiza said with flat certainty. On Pike's direct orders to make sure Gustav's discovery died with him. Most likely, the doctor agreed. But without those notes and maps, there's no way to prove what your father discovered. The water rights would revert to Pike by default, since he's been using the river the longest and has the political connections to make his claims stick in any territorial court. Elise felt a crushing weight of despair settle over her shoulders like a lead blanket. Her father had died for nothing, his great discovery buried with him in the rocky ground of Willow Spring Cemetery. The boarding house would probably be seized for back taxes within the month, and she would be left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a reputation as a criminal. Unless... Dr. Green's voice trailed off as he reached into his medical bag with the careful movements of a man handling something precious and dangerous. Your father left something with me the night before he died. Asked me to keep it safe, said it was insurance in case something happened to him. With trembling hands, he pulled out a leather portfolio, its surface worn smooth by years of handling, and marked with the careful notations that were Gustav's trademark. The portfolio was tied with leather strings and sealed with wax that bore Gustav's personal mark. A compass rose surrounded by surveyor's tools. I couldn't read most of it, Dr. Green admitted. But I kept it safe, just as he asked me to do. I figured if Gustav thought it was important enough to hide, then it was important enough to preserve no matter what happened to either of us. Elise took the portfolio with hands that shook so badly she could barely manage the leather strings. Inside were dozens of hand-drawn maps, meticulously detailed surveys, and pages of notes written in Gustav's precise German script. The maps showed every creek, every spring, every watershed in a 50-mile radius, with the Ash River's true source clearly marked on what was definitely federal land. More than that, they showed a systematic pattern of water theft that had been going on for years with detailed documentation of Pike's illegal diversions and manipulations. This is it. She whispered, her voice thick with emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. This proves everything Papa discovered and more. It proves your father was right about the water rights, Dr. Green corrected gently. But it doesn't prove Pike killed him to steal them. For that, you'd need evidence that would hold up in a court of law with witnesses and documentation that couldn't be dismissed or discredited. But as Elise continued to examine the portfolio's contents, she found something that made her heart race with excitement and fear. Tucked between the maps was a letter in Gustav's handwriting, dated the day before his death and addressed to her. Mein liebstes Kind. It began, If you are reading this, then my fears have proven justified, and I am no longer able to protect you myself. The man I once considered a friend has shown his true nature, and I fear for both our lives. The letter went on to detail Gustav's growing suspicions about Dr. Green's strange behavior in the weeks before his death, and his discovery that the doctor had been secretly meeting with Pike's representatives. But the most shocking revelation came in the final paragraph. I have hidden additional evidence where only you would think to look for it, in the place where I first taught you to read the stars and dream of the future. Trust no one completely, my daughter, but remember that even those who betray us may find redemption if their hearts are truly repentant. Elise looked up at Dr. Green, whose face had gone ashen as he read the pain and accusation in her eyes. Papa knew, she said quietly. He knew you had been meeting with Pike, didn't he? The doctor's shoulders sagged, as if a great weight had finally broken him completely. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible above the wind in the pine trees. Pike came to me a month before Gustav died. He whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. He had photographs of my daughter Mary in Denver, leaving the opium den where she goes when her sickness takes hold of her. He said if I didn't provide him with information about Gustav's survey work, Mary would be found dead in an alley with a needle in her arm and her throat cut. The confession hit Elise like a physical blow that knocked the breath from her lungs. This man, whom she had trusted above all others, had helped orchestrate Papa's murder to protect his own child from Pike's vengeance. I never told him enough to matter. Green continued desperately. Just vague information about where Gustav was working, what areas he was surveying. I never thought Pike would actually... I thought he just wanted to know what claims to file first to beat Gustav to the federal office. But you signed the death certificate, Wakiza said grimly. You ruled Gustav's death an accident when you knew it was murder. Pike threatened Mary again after Gustav died. The doctor admitted, his voice breaking with shame. Said if I asked too many questions or raised any suspicions, she would suffer for my curiosity. I've lived with that shame for 2 years, every night, seeing Gustav's face asking me why I betrayed our friendship. Then why help us now? Elise asked, struggling to understand the contradictions in this man who had been both betrayer and savior. Because I can't bring your father back, but maybe I can see justice done at last. Green replied, straightening his shoulders with visible effort. That's why I preserved his papers, why I'm helping you now. It's too late to save Gustav, but it's not too late to stop Pike from destroying anyone else. The complexity of human nature, the way good people could be forced into evil acts by circumstances beyond their control, was something Elise was only beginning to understand. But her father's letter had mentioned redemption for the repentant. And she could see genuine remorse in the doctor's eyes. There's more evidence, she said, thinking of Gustav's cryptic reference to their special place. Papa says he hid something where I would think to look for it. I know exactly where he means. Their old camping spot in the high meadow above Willow Springs, where Gustav had taught her to identify constellations and dream of a future where knowledge would triumph over ignorance. It was a 2-hour climb from the valley floor, but if Papa had hidden evidence there, it might be the proof they needed to expose Pike's crimes once and for all. I know the place you mean, Dr. Green said, having joined them on many of those camping trips during happier times. But it's dangerous country, and Pike's men are still searching everywhere for signs of you. Then we go at night, Wakiza decided. And we go prepared for trouble. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of crimson that seemed to forecast the blood that would soon be spilled, they prepared for what might be their final gambit. Dr. Green provided additional medical supplies and what weapons he could spare from his own small arsenal. More importantly, he agreed to send a telegram to the federal authorities in Denver reporting Pike's crimes and requesting immediate intervention, even if something happens to all of us. The doctor said as they prepared to part ways. There will be an official record of what we discovered. Pike won't be able to cover this up forever. The climb to their destination took them through increasingly treacherous terrain, following game trails that wound through dense forests where every shadow might hide an enemy. Elise's knowledge of the path learned during countless childhood expeditions with her father proved invaluable in the darkness. They reached the high meadow, just as the moon reached its zenith, bathing the clearing in a silver light that made every blade of grass seem to glow with its own inner fire. The place was exactly as Elise remembered it, a circle of peace surrounded by towering pines with a clear view of the stars that had once seemed to promise infinite possibilities. Gustav's hiding place was exactly where she expected it to be, beneath the large boulder where they had always sat to watch meteors streak across the summer sky. Wrapped in oiled cloth and buried in a metal box were additional survey notes, photographs, and most damning of all, correspondence between Pike and territorial officials that documented years of systematic corruption. Or this is it. Elise breathed, examining documents that would destroy Pike's empire and restore justice to the territory. This is enough evidence to hang him and everyone who helped him. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. As they prepared to leave the meadow with their precious evidence, lanterns began to appear at the edge of the forest, like malevolent eyes. Pike's men had found them probably by following Dr. Green despite his precautions, and were surrounded. Wakiza observed grimly, counting at least a dozen lights closing in from all directions. They must have been watching the doctor, waiting to see where he would lead them. They took cover behind the boulder that had yielded Gustav's evidence, preparing for what would certainly be their final battle. But as the circle of enemies tightened around them, Elise found herself thinking not of death, but of her father's words about redemption and the importance of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The attack, when it came, was swift and merciless. Pike's men opened fire from multiple directions, their bullets chipping stone from the boulder and cutting through the air with deadly whispers. Wakiza returned fire with his carbine, picking his targets carefully to make every shot count, while Elise used her father's old hunting rifle with skills learned during their mountain expeditions. But they were hopelessly outnumbered, and gradually being forced back toward the center of the meadow, where there would be no cover at all. It seemed that Gustav's evidence would die with them buried once again in this lonely place, where father and daughter had once dreamed of a better future. Then, just as their ammunition was running low and capture seemed inevitable, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the meadow. But these were not Pike's reinforcements. They were federal marshals led by Dr. Green himself, arriving at the crucial moment with warrants for Pike's arrest. The battle ended as suddenly as it had begun, with Pike's men surrendering in the face of federal authority. As dawn broke over the high meadow, Lucian Pike himself was brought forward in chains, his usual arrogance replaced by the pale fear of a man who finally understood that his crimes had caught up with him. "Miss Brennan," Marshal Samuel Morrison said as he examined Gustav's evidence, "this documentation is more than sufficient to ensure convictions for everyone involved in your father's murder and the subsequent cover-up. Justice will finally be done." 3 weeks later, Elise stood in the courthouse in Willow Springs, watching as Pike was sentenced to hang for murder and conspiracy. The water rights were officially confirmed as her property with federal protection guarantees that would prevent future attempts at theft or manipulation. But the most meaningful moment came when she knelt beside Nitz, safely recovered from Pike's hideout in her boarding house garden, showing him Gustav's compass and teaching him to read the survey maps that would shape the territory's future. "Your grandfather," she said, using the word deliberately to indicate the boy's place in her chosen family, "believed that water should serve everyone fairly. That's why he spent his life measuring and mapping so future generations would know their rights and responsibilities." Nidus nodded solemnly, his young hands tracing the compass needle as it pointed steadily north toward whatever challenges the future might bring. "Will you teach me to make maps like he did, if you want to learn?" Elise replied, thinking of how proud Papa would have been to see his work continued by this brave, intelligent boy who had survived so much. Outside the window, Ash Creek flowed free and clear through channels that now served the needs of white settlers and Cheyenne families alike, exactly as Gustav had always envisioned. Justice had been served with thoroughness and finality. The guilty had been punished according to law. The innocent had found safety and the chance to build better lives. Dr. Green, his crimes forgiven in light of his ultimate redemption, had resumed his medical practice with a renewed dedication to serving all the territory's people. Nora Avery had established a school that welcomed children of all backgrounds, teaching them to read and write and think for themselves. Adam Fitch prospered on his restored farm, no longer threatened by powerful men who saw his land as theirs by right of greed. The canvas that had nearly killed Elise was gone, now burned in the courthouse square as evidence of crimes that would never be repeated in this jurisdiction. In its place, she had something infinitely more valuable: the knowledge that justice could triumph over corruption when good people found the courage to stand together against evil. The compass in her hand continued to point steadily north toward whatever adventures and challenges the future might bring. And for the first time since Gustav's death, Elise Brennan found herself genuinely looking forward to tomorrow, and all the tomorrows that would follow. Water was indeed life, as Papa had always said. And now that life would flow freely for everyone who needed it, exactly as Gustav Brennan had always intended when he first discovered its true source in the high country where eagles soared and dreams took wing.